here in this talk, I'm going to talk to you about Pynta, which is, you've heard about ARC earlier today, probably, which is automated a software for automating quantum chemistry calculations in gas phase. And Pynta broadly is an analogous code for dealing with surface kinetics, thermochemistry and kinetics on surfaces, also including coverage dependence on surfaces. So one major challenge that we have on surfaces that we don't have in gas phase is that there's a lot of ways to put stuff on surfaces. Even on a simple low index, high symmetry surface, there are a lot of ways to put absorbates, reactants, and co-absorbates that affect energetics. Even on a simple 3x3 low facet 3x3 surface, we might have 4 unique sites. We might have 80 ways that we could put 2 different absorbates on the surface to possibly form our transition state. And if we start to put co-absorbates on our surface, even if we just restrict the co-absorbate to one site type, around a given absorbate, there are maybe 500 different ways we can place co-absorbates around that absorbate. And if we let that co-absorbate be on multiple site types, this number rapidly becomes enormous. But it's even worse than that. These numbers over here are for one absorbate, one co-absorbate, or one reaction on a low index surface. We care about a whole lot of entire mechanisms of absorbates and reactions. We care about high index surfaces that have a lot more unique sites. We also care about lots of different co-absorbates. And this creates this sort of trick of finding the lowest energy configurations that we need to accurately compute our rate coefficients in thermochemistry on surfaces. And this really emphasizes the importance of using automated workflows to handle the scale and complexity of these calculations on surfaces, and also having some carefully integrated machine learning to make our calculations more efficient and accurate. First, I'm going to talk about isolated calculations. So calculations where you're just doing an individual absorbate or an individual transition state on the surface. So broadly, Pynta is a workflow software for calculating surface and gas surface reactions. The isolated workflow is here. It takes in an adjacency list representation of the reactants and products with labels that indicate the bonds that break and form for each reaction, either the ASE, the XYZ slab, or slab information about the slab, and the quantum chemistry software method and settings that you're interested in. And it outputs your thermodynamic, thermochemistry and kinetic parameters through a long, complicated sequence of different processes. And the Fireworks workflow management software is used to manage these calculations and run them efficiently. Now, before you're running quantum chemistry software or periodic quantum chemistry software on surfaces, there are a number of important considerations to think about that you need to have figured out to get your everything correct. One of these is lattice constants. The packing of atoms in your slab is going to vary significantly between DFT methods. You need to optimize those lattice constants to define your surface. Pynta can do this for simple surfaces automatically, at least. You also need to converge your wave function cutoff and your K points values for your quantum chemistry. And these all come as sort of in some degree of inputs into Pynta. Identifying surface sites is also important. For Pynta, we use the ACAT software to find possible sites. And for simple surfaces, Pynta can do this automatically, at least. We are currently developing a pre-processing notebook that will walk users through all of these processes and automate these calculations that should hopefully be coming soon. But once we have those, we can launch our Pynta run. So here we have these adjacency list formats for our products and reactants. So here we're having an H2 dissociation. In this first one, we have H bonded to H. So we have H2 gas over 2 sites. And in this in the reactants, we have each of these H's is bonded to those X's, and from this mapping, these label mappings, Pynta is able to figure out what bonds are supposed to break and form in this reaction. We tell Pynta information about how Fireworks, or more particularly the MongoDB is configured that helps run these calculations and manage them on your cluster, and information about the reactions and surface. So nominally this file that has the reactions in them, what the surface type is, the metal, repeats of the surface, the slab, and the surrogate for purposes of, in some cases, you need this for ACAT. And then also the ASE software and settings of interest that you want to run these calculations at. And then Pynta will execute this and launch this. Pynta uses Fireworks to manage these calculation workflows. It has a nice GUI that makes it easy to track these workflows as they run, that you can visualize and you can see what calculations are running, what are ready to run, and which ones have completed, and also helps you look if any calculations go wrong. You can take a closer look at them. Once you've completed and run these calculations, we have a nice post-processing notebook, and also RMG will output the RMG libraries and .rms files with the calculated parameters for these. The post-processing notebook automates the thermochemical and kinetic parameter calculations, lets you look at different energetics for different absorbates and transition state configurations, and makes it easy to look at the IRC calculations and frequencies to sort of check things about the structures. It also has very good automated structure and transition state validity checking, although a lot of these quantum chemistry workflow softwares, this is always one of the Achilles heel. So you should always check these sorts of things first. But Pynta does a pretty good job in identifying which transition states are valid and which aren't. In terms of the algorithm, a lot of these steps, like absorbent optimization, frequency calculation, and stuff, are at least relatively. It's complex to run all of these and workflow all of these together. A lot of work to put it all together, but not necessarily so complicated. The most tricky processes in these workflows is usually absorbate surface placement and transition state guess generation. And I'll talk, absorbate guess generation works a little bit similarly, but I'm going to talk about primarily about transition state guess generation, just so you understand what's going on. So Pynta uses harmonically forced saddle point search. Commonly, a lot of in surface in catalysis, expensive and slow trajectory methods like NEB are used to find transition states on surfaces. And one of the issues with this is it makes it very impractical to run a second guess, because NEBs take so long to run that usually people will just set up one and run it out until it gives them they get an answer from it. Instead, for Pynta, we use the harmonically forced, the HFSP approach. So we use an SIDT model that predicts how long all the breaking and forming bonds in the transition state are. And we connect those associated atoms and sites with springs of that associated predicted length. And then we optimize all of these at a low level of theory with a couple other constraints, which will cause the structure to bend into a reasonable transition state guess. Since this takes almost very, very little, like 30 seconds of compute time, we're able to run this for every possible reactant product configuration on the surface. And then we can look at the strain on the springs, the harmonic energy stored in the springs, and this makes it easy to filter out unreasonable guesses from reasonable guesses. We then optimize these transition state guesses with Sela and then validate them with IRC calculations. And this enables us to search the full space of possible transition states at a comparable cost to finding one transition state with trajectory-based methods. And this is really, really important because this transition state search matters in almost any case if your reaction or your surface is even slightly complicated. Here, and it's just this hydrogen transfer on a simple facet, we get differences in barrier height of about 0.225 eV, which would be a factor of 440 in the rate coefficient at 700 Kelvin. And even for this simple OH dissociation on a high index, but relatively simple high index, these barriers varied by as much as 0.36 eV, or a factor of 400 in the rate coefficient at 700 Kelvin. So this is very important. Now, next, I'm going to talk about coverage dependence. So when we start to think about dealing with different coverages on the surface, our configuration space rapidly grows. With Pynta, it mostly focuses on enumerating a lot of the different surface sites. However, that isn't really feasible, because if we were to do that, this would result in a calculation. If we try to enumerate all coverages, even if we just consider one site type for the coabsorbate, this would cost about 125 times more than the isolated calculation. So really, we need to automatically run some critical subset of all calculations and fit a model that's able to predict the calculations we didn't run. But which calculations should we run? We use an iterative learning process to select what are the best calculations. Then we retrain, select a new set of calculations. So we do this with a subgraph isomorphic decision tree method, which you might have heard about earlier, which essentially makes predictions based starting from a labeled graph at the top of a tree with a set of molecular substructures in the tree. And at each node, our graph is checked against the subgraphs at the nodes connected to it. If it matches, it moves to that node. And if it doesn't match any of the nodes below it, it will stop where it is and make some prediction based on the node the input stopped at, which may be a prediction itself, or it may be a contribution to a prediction from multiple evaluations of the tree that might get summed. We use this because it performs very, very well in the low data regimes that we're operating in, the sub 10,000 data regime, where it helps us get more accurate models on less calculations. These SIDTs are readable and analyzable and have good uncertainties, which is really nice because we're able to leverage these SIDTs uncertainties and their sort of internal structure within themselves to select optimal calculations to run that will best minimize the uncertainty of the tree. These models become as complex as they need to be to resolve data. And maybe most importantly, they're able to inherently exploit error cancellation on relative predictions, much like group additivity methods. These trees, we're usually summing values down them. And so if we have relatively similar predictions, we're going to have a lot of similarity in these top nodes. And since those nodes, when we take differences, which is most of what we're doing in kinetic models, because everything is based on relative properties, a lot of these will cancel, and since they cancel exactly, we don't accumulate error from them. We can also use these. We can train on important. They can predict on configurations that we haven't trained on, which lets us train on the important absorbates reactions and then use model predictions for less important configurations within the space. So broadly to do this, we start from an isolated Pynta run. So we run Pynta in isolation for the absorbates, co-absorbates, transition states we care about. We calculate all pairwise configurations. So we look at every individual absorbate or transition state, and we try to put one co-absorbate all the ways we can within 3 angstroms. When these optimizations fail, we leverage them to filter out all possible surface configurations, assuming that if the pairwise configuration isn't stable, anything that has that is a subconfiguration will also be unstable, which limits our configuration space, which helps us. And then the successful ones we use to form our initial training set, which we then run in an active loop where we train our SIDT. We evaluate our entire configuration space. We leverage the internal structure of the SIDT to develop weights based on both the contributions. So what SIDT nodes were used a lot in predicting certain different configurations, the energetics of those individual configurations, and the uncertainties in those predictions. We use these weights to select an uncalculated set of configurations that best aligns with our weights. And then we calculate those new configurations and so on. This works pretty well. For this, we tested this. We demonstrated this on this ruthenium OH dissociation on ruthenium, where we enumerated the reactant in the transition state with O as a coabsorbate on all the HCP sites. And we enumerated the DFT solution here. And we have the SIDT iterations here. As you can see, it rapidly converges to these darker or the later iterations, it rapidly converges to the DFT data. And by iteration 5, we reached an MAE of about 0.05 EV relative to the enumerative, which effectively adds coverage dependence at about only 3 times the cost of the isolated run. An important consideration for using this method is that, so we have a post-processing notebook for analysis and visualization of the coverage-dependent configurations and handling that. It's a little bit less automated than the isolated notebook. Part of this notebook visualizes and provides a set of possible polynomial energy correction fits for both enthalpy of formation for absorbates and activation barriers for reactions. But There's an important nuance about this. Oftentimes the convergence isn't smooth, and you might look at this one here, where you can see we have some early iterations, very light ones here, faint ones here, that do better than some of these side ones here that kind of jump around. And what seems to tend to happen in a lot of these active learning iterations is that occasionally it will, when it tosses up new calculations, occasionally something disagrees with the model a lot. And the SIDT then sort of responds by changing some of its parameters to accommodate that. But it doesn't, it's just doing its best. So it doesn't always, and sometimes it'll change the prediction a significant bit here. But what it also does is it's going to increase the uncertainties on all of the nodes that are associated with that. And then the next iteration, it'll run a new batch of calculations that will be focused on removing those uncertainties, and then it will fix itself, essentially. And suddenly what you'll get and what you'll realize is that the new SIDT, sorry, I think this is wrong, but the new SIDT predict the latest, after that process will look very similar to the original. So in most cases, if you have a disturbance that you see that's very different from what sort of seems like a convergence, as you might look in this region, you can see these are converging. You may be better off fitting it back at that region that was converging than taking some disturbance that usually these get fixed in the active learning iteration. And this can let you get better accuracy on a few less iterations. Just a little quick demonstration of this. So if we look at ammonia decomposition on platinum, there are a lot of, if we were to run coverage dependent naive simulations, we might see that the rate at which nitrogen leaves the surface for ammonia decomposition, we have ammonia, it goes to the surface, it loses its hydrogens, and then nitrogen recombines to find nitrogen, and hydrogen recombines to make hydrogen. This is usually limited by the rate at which nitrogen leaves the surface, this nitrogen recombination reaction, which has a really high 2.3 eV barrier. And if you simulate this, you'll get that you're getting a really high coverage of nitrogen, which is blocking absorption of ammonia and not such a great catalyst. But if we run coverage dependent calculations, we can see that at high coverages, this barrier drops dramatically from 2.3 EV to about 0.3 EV. A difference of 2 whole EV, which and if, as you might imagine, if we take this and put our coverage dependent parameters into the simulation, we get a dramatically lower coverage of nitrogen, and our turnover frequency, or how good our catalyst is, has improved by more than 2 orders of magnitude. We can acknowledge funding from Exascale Catalytic Chemistry Project. Happy to take questions.
Go ahead, carry on. You can talk to the owl.
Oh, okay, perfect. My question is, what I understood from using the harmonic potentials is that you are gonna pull off the atom to a different random directions, right? But I wonder if you know a priori what will be the geometry of your adsorbent and kind of an idea of your transition state, if you can inform the workflow that you have in Pynta.
It knows. So essentially, what for HFSP, so for HFSP, what we do is we have a model. So I have a database of transition states, and I know what those transition states are of, and I know how long the transition state bond lengths are. And so what we do is we essentially fit the bond stretch factors, and we train an SIDT to predict the bond stretch factors for those. So SIDT is pretty good at getting pretty close to how long the OH bond, all of these, how long all of the bonds that are involved in the transition state should be stretched. And so based on that, what it will do is it will enumerate all of the ways. So this reaction is between OH. So this is an OH dissociation. So this is a reaction between OH and a given site. So it will look at all the places it can put that site relative to the OH, all the ways it can put OH, and all the ways that OH can be put on the surface. And it will try to it will build those harmonic potentials. It will estimate the length as a function of that site. And it will predict how long those bond lengths are supposed to be. And then it will apply that potential when it does this HFSP optimization to pull it into the transition state. Does that help?
A lot. Yeah, thank you so much.
Seth?
Yeah, real quick question. I was wondering how easy it would be to interface Pynta with a machine learned potential like from the Fairchem project.
Yep, excellent question. We've done that. What I would say is that we've done that a lot. Not necessarily. We've worked with OCP. We've worked with DeepMD Kit. It's relatively straightforward, but there's some amount of programming engineering to get everything either in the same environment or to wrap it so that it can run properly. But there's no issues with running a machine learned potential as long as ASE can find it as a calculator. It will have no trouble. And also, you can also use the machine learned potential for these HFSP things. And also for the absorbent guess generation, you can actually tell it to use the machine learned potential instead of, right now it uses XDV methods.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Follow up to that, are the machine learned potentials, I mean, I imagine they'd be great for geometry, but do you know offhand if they can do transition states? Are they accurate enough for that?
Well, not me, as Trevor Price has, who I work with, has done this. I mean, well, or actually, let me amend that. Let me ask you a question. Are you talking about a fine-tuned model or a not fine-tuned model?
Fine-tuned model.
If it's fine, you can fine-tune them to do transition states. You do need to be a little bit careful about the sampling. So you do need to sample some of the transition state structures. Although I have dealt with some of the new generation of machine learned potentials. Some of these new foundational ones are really good. They're not good at energies, but some of them can get transition state structures pretty good. In general, you're going to want to have some degree. I mean, you have to be careful how you fine tune it, but I've seen machine learned potential, especially fine tuned machine learned potentials can definitely deal with transition states. You just have to be a little bit careful about how you train them. And getting the energies correct, of course, is always a little bit, you have to be extra careful about, but yeah.
Are those machine learning potentials that are available like good for open shell systems?
Sorry?
Oh, like the machine learning potentials that are available like right now, are they good for open shell systems?
Like radicals.
Oh, open shelled. I would think they would. I think I think someone could build one that worked on open shell. I think most of the ones there are other people in the room that probably have might have other useful things to say about this. I think most of them don't, because most of the DFT that most people are, the periodic DFT that most people are using to train these, at least these models that are accurate on catalytic surfaces, is pretty bad at radicals. I would think that as a consequence, even if they were training on radicals, and probably most of them aren't, they wouldn't be very good at open-shelled species. But I think you could train one, but you'd have to be careful about how you were mishmashing data, because you're probably not going to want to use surface DFT with it, but you're probably going to still want to use surface DFT for the surface stuff. So, yeah. Any other questions?
The Pynta and Arc, and I mean, there's kind of similar job, but for surface versus gas phase, is that? Someone was asking for, was it the arc or the arc? Oh, someone was asking in the arcane talk if it's like, oh, could you use this for catalysis? And I was like, no, we've got other tools that do the same, that are analogous. What's your view on like how do these? What's the equivalent? And is it right that we keep them separate? And what's the Pynta equivalent to?
I mean, I think keeping them separate makes sense, and the reason for that is it really comes down to the first slide here, which is there's the surface is fundamentally dominated by us having to deal with all these ways that we can put stuff on the surface. This is just this is just so characteristic. It changes everything in how you have to deal with the surface. So much. I think that makes it sense to keep them separate. Just because it ends up being a very different problem. And also, I mean, the other part is, of course, you're probably going to do these at different DFT anyway. But this is why I think you wouldn't, it would be hard to merge two codes to do sort of a universal thing, is simply because the problem that they're solving ends up, it looks on paper, it looks the same, but in practice, it can be very different. There's a lot of different considerations, I think.
Yeah, maybe come up for, let me give you a microphone. Yeah.
So can we the harmonic software calculation? Use DFT for the harmonic software calculation during your Pynta setup. Like instead of TB Lite.
For HFSP? For this?
Yeah, for your harmonic software.
So the reason, so this is the funny thing about this is that the level of theory that we do with this doesn't actually matter that much. And the reason is because we have these all the really important degrees of freedom in the system are being constrained by these harmonic potentials. So you could use DFT for it. And you can use machine learning potentials for it. It doesn't matter so much. And the reason is because all we're really leaving up to whatever the level of theory is what it does with the degrees of freedom. And this, like if this had atoms out here, it's what happens to the reason we're doing that is we know what happens to those atoms when we bend this over, right? The transition state, the key degrees of freedom that we really care about, which is forming the transition state, is all constrained by these HFSP springs. So what we're only really asking, what we're doing at the low level of theory is not it's not getting a transition state. We're just asking it to figure out what to do move everything else in a reasonable manner, essentially. So you could do it at DFT. It wouldn't cause any inherent issues, but it probably wouldn't help you that much either, if that makes sense.